How is it going, everybody, and welcome back to... You know what, whatever. No matter how I try to sugarcoat this, what we're doing today is dumb. And it's definitely not the first time we're doing something stupid on the channel, but this one is kinda pushing it. So I was just randomly browsing the internet one day, as you do, and I stumbled upon this image, and what can I say? I felt inspired. In the context of Subnautica, I started thinking, man, I sure missed the Terraformer, which would allow you to probably do stuff like this in the game. And then I thought to myself, wait a second, mods are a thing, and an idea was born. What we're doing today is we're going to be downloading the Terraforming Ability mod, and then we're going to be using the Terraformer to slice the entire floating island in half, so that a Cyclops can swim right through it. Now I understand that as a sane person you might be asking yourself, why on earth would you do this? But we don't ask questions like that around here. So strap in, grab your Terraformer, and let's do this. Now, to begin this build, I wanted to find a direct path through the island. As you can imagine, the island is pretty massive, and the last thing I wanted happening was me building through and suddenly realizing my entire build is crooked. Now, in terms of where I would be building, just to make this not too easy, I decided to build through a relatively thick part of the island where there wouldn't be any Degassi bases, but I would also be getting a bit of the mountain so that it can look really epic by the end. To start us off, I decided to build one line of straight compartments that would lead from one end of the island to another. Luckily, the Terraforming Ability mod also makes it so that if you build any base pieces, it will clear out the space around them to accommodate them. And so that's exactly what I did. This quickly put into perspective just how freaking massive the island is and how long this would take, but alas, I was committed at this point. So I pulled out the Terraformer and got to work. You might be wondering, why not just do the whole thing by building base pieces, which would probably be much faster? Well, my whole idea of this challenge was to use the Terraformer to see if, had it been implemented, something like this would have been possible using just that tool. The only reason I made the original line of bases was just to have a nice reference point. First, I started to work right on the water, and I would build a shallow canal, if you will, straight under the base pieces. If you don't know how the Terraformer works, holding the left mouse button and dragging will spawn these spheres, let's say, which indicate where some terrain will either be removed or added. That's why you will repeatedly see me drawing some shapes on the ground, and then the ground receding. I eventually get into a rhythm of drawing a sort of square-shaped grid that I would then fill out with these spheres, so that I was getting a relatively even distribution of the ground that was being removed. Look, I'm not gonna lie, this was already taking longer than I had anticipated, but eventually I managed to make my way all the way to the other side with this. You can also start to see the trend of small pieces of rock kind of floating in the air. This is just something that kept on happening, and I wasn't able to get all of them removed at the end to make it look nicer, but I tried to kind of clean up the build as I went. This should also now give you a pretty good idea of how big of an effort this was going to be. Now, to get an idea of how large we would need to make this, I decided to build the Cyclops and park it right in front of the opening to kind of get a gauge of how tall it is and, more importantly, how wide it is. The thing that I realized real quick is that the Cyclops is freaking massive. It is way larger than I anticipated and especially wider, which would mean not only that I would need to really widen my efforts, but that I would also need to get rid of any jagged protrusions sticking out of the sides that could potentially get caught on the hull of the ship. What I did is I tried speeding up the game time so that I would be able to progress faster, but to be honest, this only worked to a limited amount, because while yes, it did remove the terrain faster, it also made it kind of harder to focus on even distribution, and I would end up with a lot of terrain that just needed to be cleaned up afterwards, so I kind of used it sparingly. At this point, I also ran into the issue of the massive floaters. If you don't know, right under the island there are these massive ancient floaters that are essentially holding the whole structure up according to the lore. The thing is, these things have hitboxes even on the other side, which obviously normally you would never encounter, but because they do, I needed to be able to get rid of them. Luckily, building a base piece in this hitbox will actually despawn the floater, so I was able to just get rid of the ones that were in my way. Now at this point, I was pretty satisfied with the depth, even though, yes, eventually I would be cutting all the way through, and to get a bit of a change of pace, I started building on top of the base. I would always paint, quote-unquote, in the shape of an arch, let's say, trying to sort of mimic the width that I established on the water. Now look, I'm not gonna lie to you, this took freaking forever, but eventually I had the entire thing sort of excavated so that I was able to now freely walk on top of the base and swim under it through the island, essentially building a tunnel. I did run into a few more of those strange invisible hitboxes similar to the ones from the floaters, but again, building a base piece in them was able to resolve the issue. Now at this point, it was all about widening and expanding. I hit this corridor and was able to stand on top of the base, which was very nice for working, but there was still a ton of material that needed to be excavated, since I not only wanted to be able to fit the ship through, but also cut through the entire island top to bottom. You will also begin to see a trend of floating vegetation from now on. This is unfortunately something I was not always able to resolve. Certain bits of vegetation, like trees or mushrooms, you can despawn by building a base piece on top of them, but for these ferns and smaller bushes, it unfortunately doesn't work. Once I'd hollowed out enough of the cave, I decided to build another level to my base, basically like scaffolding, so that I would be able to continue building higher. Look, I'm not gonna lie, this was not the most fun I've ever had in Subnautica. It was entertaining for sure, but it was a really repetitive job, essentially painting in some sort of a square or sphere-shaped grid, and then waiting for the game to recompile the terrain and going again. I was very happy with the progress I was making. In terms of the vertical stuff, I was about midway through, but you can see that I was slowly approaching something that I kind of been dreading, and that's the mountain. The mountain itself is an absolute mass of material that would need to be removed, and let's not forget that at this point, the canal was still not wide enough to actually accommodate the Cyclops. Nonetheless, I started working my way through the mountain. Here you can also see me using the base building method to despawn some of the trees and vegetation. Again, this wouldn't work on everything, but I was able to remove at least a little bit of this floating stuff to kind of clean up the entire aesthetic. At this point, I had to add another floor to my base because there is actually a range limit on how far the terraformer can reach, and I needed to keep working on the mountain. And while it felt like the time would never come, hours of work later, I was able to actually cut through the rest of the mountain, and now the entire top of the island was exposed. This felt freaking awesome, and this one I was able to kind of step back a little bit with free cam and take a look at how epic this build was turning out to be. You can also see my scaffolding of a base in the middle. To clean up a little bit, I decided to deconstruct some of the base pieces and then continue working underwater again. Now, once the entire thing was done and the island was effectively completely sliced in half, I was about to jump back into my Cyclops and see just how much wider it would need to be to accommodate the sub. I swam towards it and immediately realized, oh boy, it will need to be a little bit wider because at the present, there's no way I can fit through. Definitely not discouraging or anything. And so, the widening began. I was slowly working my way through the island, always pushing the Cyclops a little bit in, excavating the bit in front of it so that it would comfortably fit through, and then going a bit further just so I can have a point of reference for the width. I also removed any remnants of the weird stalactites that hang below the water down from the island bottom. Again, this process took forever. It wasn't particularly exciting, but I was already feeling the end in sight, so I was motivated to get this done. And at last, after hours of work and digging, it was done. I was able to swim with the Cyclops all throughout the entire island, having sliced in half from top to bottom. Here you can see some of the initial tests where I'm trying if it's possible in the first person, and even though I'm getting all the warnings on the Cyclops, I didn't actually bump into anything. A few minor adjustments later, I built a few base pieces around as like watchtowers and maybe control centers for this canal, and it was done. Here you can see the fruits of my labor. I introduced to you the floating island canal. A structure that cuts right across the entire floating island, and yes, if this was actually using physics, it would probably drift apart at this point. But I do have to say, I think it looks pretty epic. Now, in conclusion, is this completely pointless because you can swim below or around the island? Yes, of course. Was it still a ton of fun to do? Sure, I mean, if you consider kind of excavating dirt for hours on time fun. But you know, over time, as I've been doing a lot of weird Subnautica challenges, my standards have really dropped. But anyways, with that, if you guys want to try this out yourself, the link to the mod is down in the description below. And if you enjoyed the video, maybe consider leaving a like, commenting, or subscribing. All of those would be very much appreciated. With that, I'm going to wish you all a beautiful rest of the day, and I'll see you legends in whatever next video I make. Bye bye.